All right, I got a great question from somebody who hit me up on Instagram. It basically said, you've been making a lot of great stuff for all the beginners out there, but how about some stuff for some people who already know how to TIG weld and now want to take things to the next level? Absolutely great idea for an episode. So have you got some good experience TIG welding already? Let's get you working on a few things that are gonna get you to the next level of really laying down some nice dimes. Now, these techniques we're gonna go over here, it's the same thing I go over with my online TIG welding students. Now, some of these students that I'm working with already have a good amount of experience. And when we wanna take their game with TIG welding to the next level, the main subject that we are gonna focus on is consistency. Now, when I use this term, I'm basically gonna take a look at any type of weld and we're gonna compare variables throughout each one. And we're gonna try and get these as perfect as we can. And believe me, I'm gonna break things down in a crazy way later in this episode. It might even scare you how much I focus on these details. We'll check that out later in this episode though. So we are going to first focus on two specific variables that we are going to perfect. The first is gonna be the overall width and profile. And the second variable is gonna be the stepping consistency. I guess that's kind of three, but whatever. So to break down what I mean by the overall width and profile, essentially it is pretty straightforward, but what we want to see with each weld is a consistent width from start to finish. The welding area is going to obviously be a little bit colder at the beginning of a pass, and obviously towards the end of a pass, things are gonna start getting really hot. So what is typical when we see people kind of needing to work on the consistency of this variable is starting out and traveling away from the start of a pass. Once things start to heat up and get a little bit spicy towards the end of a plate, we're gonna see the detail of our width start to flare out. Sometimes it may be a lot like you're looking at here. Sometimes it might be just a little bit, but this creates inconsistency with the width at the end of a pass compared to where we started out at the beginning. So this is gonna be one of the main things that we focus on for sure. No matter what joint configuration we are using, we want this detail to be perfect. Okay, the second thing essentially that we're gonna look at here is the profile. So basically to describe what I mean by this, let's take a look at things from this angle here. From this angle, we can take a look at the overall reinforcement of the weld, and we can also see how smoothly the filler material is blending into the base material. This is very important. So essentially this angle here is what I refer to as the profile of a weld. This refers to any plate configuration or joint configuration. You can see me flipping through a few different ones here. So the overall profile combined with the variable of width. These two variables are the first ones that we're gonna focus on. Now the second, or I guess maybe the third variable that I mentioned was stepping consistency. So I've actually done an episode specifically on this detail. It's so important. Now stepping consistency refers to the distance in between each step where filler material is added. But essentially what we wanna see is the overall stepping distance being consistent from the start to finish. So during a pass, we do not wanna see any areas where the stepping consistency loses its consistency. So perfecting the variables of width, profile, and stepping consistency, this is a pretty mean trio of improvements that can make a huge difference with somebody's work. So what we're gonna do is typically drop back and start working on some of these details on flat plate. Even for somebody at an intermediate level or even a somewhat advanced level, there are a ton of improvements that we can make working on these variables. And this is where we're gonna start to get hyper focused on working on these things. So looking at some of these examples from my online TIG welding students, whether it's just a stringer pass on a flat piece of plate or a butt joint configuration, we can see that the goal is to get the overall width and profile really consistent from start to finish. What we're doing is we're also focusing on the overall stepping consistency. Like I've talked about before, a lot of people work with different stepping consistencies. It's completely fine. But the main thing that we remember is whatever stepping distance somebody is working, we want to keep that consistent across all of their work. Practicing these details on a simple configuration on something like this is going to be the easiest way to perfect these details. Obviously, one of the trickiest spots to really master this is with the start-stop in the center, working with two separate passes. The first one obviously being a little bit colder, and then for the second getting reset and working on the second half with a plate that is much warmer. Getting the consistency between these two different passes is where the real money work starts to happen for people. Focusing on these two variables is very simple in this configuration here. You don't have a variable like gravity pulling on one side of the joint like you would with a fillet weld or something like that. It allows us to concentrate on these details specifically. So this is where we start. Once somebody has gotten some real consistency and confidence with things at this level, now it's time to take what we have learned to the next level. We're gonna crank that difficulty up. So what I like doing is picking a joint that's a little bit more challenging for some of my students. A lot of students typically struggle with the lap joint. This is a real pesky one for a lot of people to deal with. It's all good. So for the sake of the example here today, let's use that one. But what we are gonna learn is something that I call the split direction weld. I'm going to demonstrate this with this example here. You can see I am firing up the CanaWeld 201 Pulse D for this one. This machine is perfect for entry-level or beginner welders, as well as intermediate or advanced welders. I've used this machine on my channel for like years now. It's absolutely awesome. So we're going to challenge our skill as far as consistency a lot on this one. You ready? What I'm going to do is I'm going to weld the first half of this joint in a way that I am most comfortable. What I'm going to do is I'm going to finish the length of this one, and then I'm going to stop in the center like this. So what I'm going to do at this point is now I'm going to flip this plate so it's facing the other way. So now I'm going to use this different angle to complete the second half, and we're going to connect the weld in the center. Seems pretty simple, right? Give me a second. So you can see in my hand, I am now holding the torch in what I call an overhand grip. I'm essentially doing the exact same weld on the exact same joint, but now I've made things much more tricky for myself, both with my posture as well as the way that the weld is going to settle into the joint itself. So what we have done here now is essentially take what we know how to do really well with the first half, and we've added a couple more variables to make this one a little bit more challenging, but still doable so that this new challenge is not too difficult. So after we finish this one, we're gonna compare the first half that we did to the second half that we did in a more challenging position. So remember the first two things that we went over earlier? The first thing we're gonna look at is the overall width of this one. Is it consistent from the start all the way to the finish in between both of these passes? Now, how about the overall profile? Look at the amount of filler used on each half. And we can look at how it translated into a good line on the bottom of this joint. And of course, like we talked about, the third thing. How was the stepping consistency across the entire plate? We don't want to see any areas that have a tighter stepping distance in comparison to other areas on the plate. And we obviously don't want to see any stepping distances that are spaced out a little bit further apart. Listen, even for myself, this is a real challenge to do sometimes. I'm taking something that I'm really used to doing in one specific way, and now I'm doing it in a completely different configuration that is much more challenging. And the most important thing about this exercise at this point here is we are now taking the time to break down and scrutinize every single detail from one direction that we've done this to the other side. We have two perfect examples right here that we can compare to one another as far as consistency. Both of these examples are literally on the same joint. What you can do is you can bust out a ruler or a tape measure. You can see here I'm checking out the straightness of the edges. Straightness? How straight it is? Hey Siri, is straightness a real word? As well as the overall width in a couple different areas as well. You can even do one of my favorite exercises to test out your stepping consistency. You ready for this? This is something that I briefly mentioned on my channel a couple times, but this is one of the most badass ways that you can check your stepping consistency. So what I want you to do is pick a random area on each side of this exercise. What you're gonna do is randomly select 5 steps from each of these areas. You're gonna highlight or mark these out, and you're gonna measure the distance that each of these 5 steps cover. You can literally compare the measurement from side to side. Pick a cold area compared to a hot area or something like that. You get the idea. Now what we are doing here is getting down to the levels of consistency at a psychotic level. This is the type of stuff I used to do all the time. I've talked about it on my channel a lot before. When I first got going with TIG welding, I wanted to be the best TIG welder I could really badly. And even when I felt confident at doing something all the time, I wanted to improve even more no matter what I was doing. And even after decades of TIG welding in the trade and actual production TIG welding, I still would do exercises like this all the time to test myself. I show stuff like this to people sometimes and they for sure call me crazy, but this makes learning a lot of fun. Challenging yourself in ways like this is a great way to take your welding to the next level. And in doing so, you're gonna learn even more about the trade that I love so much. Now, like we talked about, probably one of the most challenging variables that we went over is the subject of stepping consistency. This is a really tedious thing to understand, so watch this episode next. You can get a free textbook to download that accompanies this episode. Go grab those while they're still available. Go to a random act of kindness for a stranger today. My name is Dusty. Fill and chill. We will talk soon. Peace.